Hello, class, and welcome to Mr. Brandis' fourth podcast out of 5. This is a podcast on evolution, and in this podcast, we're going to talk about evolution and how it creates diversity. We're going to talk about the biological species concept. We're going to talk about speciation, and we're also going to talk about micro versus macroevolution. So, evolution begets diversity, which means evolution causes a change to allow new creatures to come about. This is quite obvious when you go into a deep sea dive and you see a variety of fish and a variety of coral and other creatures that are all swimming around in the same area, and you can see quite a lot of diversity. And this is because of millions of years of evolution. All of these creatures have filled their own little niche in their environment, and yet they all come from some common ancestor. So the way that we define a species is according to the biological species concept. Many biologists use the biological species concept, which defines a species as a population or group of populations whose members have the ability to breed with one another in nature and produce fertile offspring. So this basically says if you are able to breed with another member of your group, you are of the same species. Now, as species diversify and become different, you lose the ability to breed with those other creatures. So there's two additional ways to define a species, and one is the morphological species concept, which is a definition of species in terms of anatomical criteria. So essentially, if they look alike and have similar parts, then they are of the same species. The other way of defining a species is through the ecological species concept. The ecological species concept basically says if you're filling the same role in the environment, and we call that a niche, if you're filling that same role in the environment, you are of the same species. What starts out as microevolution can be magnified into macroevolution. Macroevolution and adaptation explain how populations evolve. The term macroevolution encompasses a more dramatic biological change, and many of which are evident in the fossil record. These changes include the origin of different species, the extinction of species, and the evolution of new major features of living things. So the origin of new species is called speciation, and it is the main focus and study of macroevolution. And don't forget, if one species evolves into two or more surviving species, that also increases our diversity. For example, this figure on the right shows a simple diagram of speciation and how it can lead to an increase in the number of species. In this case, the ancestral or original species branches into two separate species. And again, this is increasing diversity. And what we can do is we can take these and plot them out, and as creatures develop and evolve, they become so different they're no longer able to breed with one another, and that makes them a separate species. Darwin viewed Linnaeus's system of classification in the context of evolutionary history. Ever since, biologists have strived to have classification also represent the evolutionary relationships among species. Don't forget, species are classified as groups within groups. For example, the dog and the wolf on the right-hand corner are both members of the same genus, which is Canis. And those members are obviously quite alike. They have similar features, but yet wolves and domesticated dogs do not breed with one another, and therefore we classify those as separate species. There are two types of speciation, how we create new species. One is allopatric speciation, which is the formation of a new species in populations that are geographically isolated from one another. This is also known as geographic isolation. Sympatric speciation is the formation of a new species within the same geographic location. So taking a look at geographic isolation, or allopatric speciation, we can see here that we have a group of beetles, and they can become separated by some form of barrier. And then as they move on in time, they can become separate species, because these alleles on the bottom side and these alleles on the top side might be different. And therefore, as time goes on, the species separates into two separate species that are no longer able to breed with one another. So that's allopatric speciation. They're separated by some form of border. In some cases, species that are separated and then rejoin can still be a part of the same species. So that means they haven't lost the ability to breed with one another yet. And so they can re-merge into that same population, that same species. Now, depending on how much time and the alleles that are present in each group determines as to whether or not that will happen or not. One example of allopatric speciation is the blue-headed wrasse and the Cortez rainbow wrasse. These two were separated by the Isthmus of Panama, which was created millions of years ago. But originally, those were the same fish. And because so much time has passed, because they were separated and so much time has passed, they are now separate species. So that's the end of the podcast. Thank you for listening. Again, if you have any questions or you didn't quite understand something, you should go back, rewatch the podcast, and take notes on it. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to write those down, and I will address them in class. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.